6 months later, Emma sat in Father O'Brien's office wearing jeans and a comfortable sweater, looking healthier and more at peace than she had in years. She had gained back the weight she had lost during her relationship with David, and the constant tension that had marked her features was gone. Her eyes were bright and clear, no longer holding the fear and desperation that had been so evident on her wedding day. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I know what you did that day couldn't have been easy. You risked a lot to help me." Father O'Brien smiled warmly. "Emma, in my 30 years of ministry, stopping your wedding was one of the most important things I've ever done. I've married hundreds of couples, but I've never been prouder of a ceremony that didn't happen." The aftermath of that dramatic day had been challenging, but ultimately healing for Emma and her family. David had initially tried to salvage his reputation, claiming that Emma had suffered a mental breakdown due to wedding stress. However, as more people came forward with their own observations of his controlling and aggressive behavior, his story fell apart. 3 other women who had dated him in the past also came forward with similar experiences of emotional and physical abuse. Emma had moved back in with her parents temporarily while she rebuilt her life. With the support of her family, friends, and an excellent therapist, she had begun to understand how the abuse had started so subtly that she hadn't recognized it until it was severe. David had systematically isolated her from her support system, controlled her finances, and used his professional connections to threaten her career. The hardest part, Emma reflected, was realizing how many people had tried to help me along the way, but I was too scared to accept it. My sister had been asking questions for months. My co-workers had noticed changes in my behavior. Even you, during our pre-marriage counseling, had seemed concerned about something. Father O'Brien nodded. Abuse thrives in isolation and silence. The moment you found the courage to speak the truth, David's power over you began to crumble. Emma had returned to work at the pediatric ward, where she was welcomed back with overwhelming support from her colleagues. Dr. Mitchell had been true to her word. Emma's job was secure, and David's threats about destroying her career had proven empty. In fact, Emma's experience had led her to become an advocate for domestic violence awareness within the hospital system. She had also started volunteering with a local domestic violence shelter, sharing her story with other women who were trying to escape abusive relationships. Her experience of speaking out at the very altar had become a powerful example of how it's never too late to change course, no matter how public or committed the situation might seem. "I got a letter from David last week," Emma mentioned casually. "His lawyer sent it. He's apparently engaged to someone new already." Father O'Brien's expression grew concerned. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, I feel sorry for her, but I also sent an anonymous tip to the domestic violence hotline in their city, sharing what I knew about his patterns. It's up to her to decide what to do with that information, but at least she'll have resources if she needs them." Emma had also taken steps to ensure her own continued safety and healing. She had moved to a new apartment across town, changed her phone number, and obtained a restraining order. She was seeing a therapist regularly and had reconnected with friends she had lost touch with during her relationship with David. "I'm actually dating someone new," Emma said with a shy smile. "His name is Marcus, and he's a teacher at my father's school. The difference is incredible. He encourages me to spend time with my family and friends. He supports my career goals. He's never once raised his voice to me or made me feel afraid." Father O'Brien beamed with genuine happiness. "That's wonderful news, Emma. You deserve all the love and respect in the world." As Emma prepared to leave, she turned back to Father O'Brien one more time. "Do you ever regret stopping the wedding? I know it caused a lot of drama and probably upset some people in the congregation." The priest considered her question carefully before responding. "Emma, my job is to serve God by serving His people. That day, God was asking me to protect you, and I'm grateful I listened. Your happiness and safety are worth far more than a smooth ceremony or avoiding some uncomfortable conversations." Emma walked out of the church into the bright afternoon sunshine, feeling truly free for the first time in years. The wedding that never happened had turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to her. Sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones when someone cares enough to help you change course, even when it's difficult and complicated. Father, O'Brien watched her go, offering a silent prayer of gratitude that he had trusted his instincts that day. In his decades of ministry, he had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to interrupt someone's plans and help them find a better path. Father O'Brien turned to address the congregation, his voice calm but commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, this wedding will not be continuing today. I ask that you please exit the church quietly and respectfully. The family will be in touch regarding any future arrangements. The church exploded into chaos. David's face contorted with rage, and he stepped toward Emma aggressively. What did you tell him? He demanded, his voice low and threatening. What lies are you spreading now? But before he could get any closer, Emma's father and several groomsmen stepped between them. Emma's father, a quiet man who worked as a high school principal, had seen enough troubled young people in his career to recognize the signs he had missed in his own daughter's relationship. The pieces were falling into place. Emma's weight, loss, her increasing isolation from family and friends, the way she always seemed nervous when David was around. Stay away from my daughter, he said firmly, his protective instincts fully activated. Emma's sister Maria wrapped her arms around her, whispering reassurances and apologies for not seeing what was happening sooner. We're going to get you out of here, she promised. You're safe now. Father O'Brien had quickly summoned the church security and had already called the police. He knew from experience that situations like this could escalate quickly, and he wanted professionals on hand to ensure everyone's safety. He also knew that Emma would need support and resources to escape this relationship safely. The congregation began filing out, many in shock and confusion. Some guests were angry about the disruption to what they thought would be a beautiful celebration. Others, particularly Emma's co-workers from the hospital, were beginning to understand what had really been happening. They remembered incidents they had witnessed, times when Emma had bruises she explained away as clumsiness, occasions when David had shown up at the hospital unexpectedly to check on Emma, and his controlling behavior that they had initially mistaken for devotion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Emma's supervisor at the pediatric ward, pushed through the crowd to reach her. Emma, honey, we've got you, she said firmly. Whatever you need, the whole department is behind you. And don't you worry about your job. David has no power over your career. We know what kind of nurse you are, and we'll protect you. David was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized his carefully constructed image was crumbling. He had spent years building a reputation as a respected cardiologist and the perfect boyfriend. He had isolated Emma from many of her friends and family members, making her financially dependent on him and convinced her that no one would believe her if she spoke out against him. This is ridiculous, he shouted to anyone who would listen. She's having a breakdown, she's mentally unstable, you can't believe anything she says. But his protests fell on deaf ears. Too many people were now remembering signs they had overlooked, and his aggressive behavior in the church was only confirming their worst suspicions. The police arrived and immediately took control of the situation, separating David from Emma and the other family members. Father O'Brien stayed close to Emma throughout the chaos. You did the right thing, he told her quietly. I know this feels terrible right now, but you just saved your own life, and probably the lives of any children you might have had with him. Emma nodded through her tears, feeling simultaneously terrified and relieved. For the first time in months, she could breathe freely. The elaborate wedding dress that had felt so beautiful that morning now felt like a costume from a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Father O'Brien made his decision. He gently closed his ceremonial book and addressed the congregation with the authority that came from 3 decades of pastoral experience. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief intermission. Please, remain seated while I speak privately with the wedding party. The church erupted in confused chatter. This was unprecedented. Wedding guests pulled out their phones to text family members who couldn't attend, sharing the strange turn of events. David's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. This was supposed to be his perfect day, and now it was turning into a spectacle. What are you doing? David whispered harshly to the priest. This is completely inappropriate. Emma is just nervous. We need to continue. But Father O'Brien's attention remained focused on Emma, who was now visibly trembling. "Emma, I need you to look at me," he said softly, ignoring David's protests. "Can you do that for me?" When Emma lifted her eyes to meet his, Father O'Brien saw something that confirmed all his suspicions. There was terror there, but not the kind that came from wedding jitters. This was the look of someone who was trapped, someone who was desperate, but didn't know how to ask for help. He had seen this expression before, unfortunately, and it always meant the same thing. "David, I need you to step back for a moment," Father O'Brien instructed firmly. When the groom protested again, the priest's voice took on a tone that brooked no argument. "Step back now." Emma's sister Maria had been watching everything unfold with growing alarm. She suddenly remembered the phone call from Emma 2 weeks ago when her sister had started to say something about David, but then quickly changed the subject. At the time, Maria had been busy with her own children and hadn't pressed for details. Now she wished she had. "Emma," Father O'Brien said, his voice gentle but urgent, "I've been doing this for a long time, and I can see that you're in distress. This is your moment to speak. Whatever is wrong, you can tell me. You're safe here." The congregation held its collective breath. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening and had grown quiet. Emma looked around at all the faces staring at her, her parents, her friends, her colleagues, David's family. So many people had invested time, money, and emotion into this day. How could she possibly destroy it all? But then she looked at Father O'Brien again, and something inside her broke open. The words she had been holding back for weeks came pouring out in a whisper that only he could hear. "He hits me, Father. David hits me when he gets angry. And he said if I ever try to leave him, he'll make sure I lose my job, and no hospital will ever hire me again. He has connections everywhere in the medical community." The priest's expression didn't change, but Emma saw understanding and compassion in his eyes. He had suspected some form of abuse, but hearing it confirmed still hit him like a physical blow. He had performed hundreds of weddings, joining couples in love and happiness. This was the first time he had ever been asked to stop a ceremony, because the bride was essentially being forced to marry her abuser. Father O'Brien knew he had to act quickly and carefully. David was standing just a few feet away, growing more agitated by the moment. The congregation was getting restless, and the situation could spiral out of control if not handled properly. But most importantly, he had a young woman who had just confessed to being in an abusive relationship and was asking for help in the only way she could. "Emma," he said quietly, "do you want to marry David today?" The simple question cut through all the complexity and confusion. Emma shook her head, almost imperceptibly, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks.
"If anyone present knows of any reason why David and Emma should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace," Father O'Brien announced, his voice carrying more weight than usual. The church fell into complete silence as
it always did during this moment. But this time the priest's attention was entirely focused on the bride. Emma's eyes darted around the church frantically. Her breathing became even more labored, and she began to sway more noticeably. The maid of honor, her sister Maria, noticed something was wrong and took a small step closer, ready to steady her if needed. The bouquet in Emma's hands began to shake visibly. Father O'Brien had seen enough. His 30 years of experience told him that something was seriously wrong with this bride, and he couldn't in good conscience continue the ceremony without addressing it. The silence stretched on longer than usual as he made a decision that would shock everyone present. "Emma," he said gently, breaking from the traditional script, "are you feeling all right, my child?" The question sent a ripple of concerned murmurs through the congregation. David looked confused and slightly annoyed at the interruption. This wasn't part of the ceremony they had rehearsed. Emma's parents exchanged worried glances, while David's family looked on with growing confusion. Emma looked up at Father O'Brien with tears beginning to form in her eyes. In that moment she saw not just the priest who was supposed to marry her, but a man who genuinely cared about her well-being. The kindness in his eyes was almost too much to bear, and she felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. I'm fine, Father," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her. It was barely audible and trembling with emotion. She tried to force a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. The internal battle she had been fighting for weeks was reaching its breaking point, and the stress was manifesting in ways she couldn't control. David reached for her free hand, trying to offer support, but Emma flinched slightly at his touch. This small reaction didn't go unnoticed by the observant priest. Something was very wrong between these two people who were supposed to be madly in love and ready to spend their lives together. "Perhaps we should take a brief moment," Father O'Brien suggested, his voice calm but firm. He had never stopped a wedding ceremony before, but his instincts were screaming that he needed to intervene. The congregation began to whisper more loudly, sensing that something unusual was happening. Emma's sister Maria moved even closer, placing a protective hand on her sister's arm. She had noticed Emma's strange behavior over the past few weeks but had attributed it to wedding planning stress. Now she realized there might be something much more serious going on. The church atmosphere had shifted from joyful celebration to tense uncertainty. Wedding guests looked around at each other, unsure of what was happening or what they should do. Some pulled out their phones, thinking perhaps Emma was having a medical emergency. Others whispered theories about what could be causing this disruption to what should have been a perfect day. Father O'Brien knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue with the ceremony and hope everything worked out, or he could trust his instincts and take action to protect someone who might be in trouble. Emma reached the altar and her father kissed her cheek before placing her hand in David's. The congregation settled into their seats as Father O'Brien opened his ceremonial book. The wedding party arranged themselves perfectly, with bridesmaids on one side and groomsmen on the other, all beaming with happiness for the couple. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join David and Emma in holy matrimony," Father O'Brien began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the church. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Emma's face. Something was definitely wrong. As he continued with the traditional opening words, he noticed how Emma's grip on her bouquet tightened with each passing moment. Her knuckles had turned white, and despite the cool temperature inside the church, small beads of perspiration had formed on her forehead. David, completely focused on the ceremony, seemed oblivious to his bride's distress. The priest had developed an ability over the years to read people during significant moments in their lives. Weddings, funerals, baptisms. These events brought out genuine emotions that people couldn't always hide. Emma's body language screamed that something was terribly wrong, but what could it be? Had she discovered something about David? Was she having second thoughts? Or was there something more serious happening? Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God, Father O'Brien continued, but his mind was racing. He had a responsibility to ensure that both parties were entering this union willingly and with full knowledge of what they were doing. Emma's breathing had become shallow and rapid. She tried to focus on David's loving gaze, on the beautiful flowers, on anything that would calm her nerves. But the feeling that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks was now overwhelming. It wasn't just cold feet or wedding anxiety. This was something much more serious, something she had been trying to ignore and push away. The congregation watched adoringly as their beloved couple stood at the altar. Emma's co-workers from the pediatric ward wiped away happy tears, remembering how she had talked about this day with such excitement. David's medical colleagues nodded approvingly at what they saw as a perfect match between two dedicated healthcare professionals. But Emma's mind was elsewhere entirely. She was thinking about the conversation she had overheard 3 weeks ago, when she had returned home early from work with a migraine, the voices coming from David's study, the hushed tones, the words that had made her blood run cold. She had convinced herself she must have misunderstood, that her illness was making her paranoid. After all, David was everything a woman could want: successful, handsome, caring, and devoted to her. Father O'Brien reached the part of the ceremony where he would ask if anyone objected to the union. His eyes swept across the congregation, but more importantly, he was watching Emma's reaction. Her face had gone completely pale, and she was swaying slightly on her feet. This was more than nervousness. This woman was in genuine distress. The morning sun cast a golden glow through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, as Emma Rodriguez stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal preparation room. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her grandmother's pearl necklace, the same one that had been worn by 3 generations of women in her family on their wedding days. The ivory silk dress hugged her figure perfectly, its intricate lace details catching the light with every movement. "You look absolutely stunning, sweetheart," her mother whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The room buzzed with excitement, as bridesmaids in soft lavender dresses fluttered around, making final adjustments to bouquets and touching up lipstick. Emma's sister Maria carefully positioned the cathedral-length veil, ensuring every fold fell gracefully. Outside, guests were already filling the church pews. Friends from college, family members who had traveled from across the country, and colleagues from the hospital where Emma worked as a pediatric nurse all gathered to witness this special day. The groom, David Chen, waited nervously at the altar, with his best man, checking his watch and smoothing his tie for the 100th time that morning. Father Michael O'Brien, who had been serving the parish for over 30 years, reviewed his notes one final time. He had officiated hundreds of weddings throughout his career, but there was something about today that felt different. Perhaps it was the way Emma had seemed distracted during their pre-marriage counseling sessions, or how she would sometimes stare off into space when discussing their future together. He pushed these thoughts aside, attributing them to normal pre-wedding jitters. The church organist began playing the processional music, and Emma's heartbeat quickened. This was the moment she had dreamed about since she was a little girl playing dress-up in her mother's closet. Yet something felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She had attributed these feelings to wedding stress, but as she took her father's arm and prepared to walk down the aisle, a knot formed in her stomach. The heavy wooden doors of the church opened and Emma stepped into view. A collective gasp of admiration rose from the congregation as she began her slow walk down the red-carpeted aisle. Her father, tears streaming down his cheeks, squeezed her arm gently. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, creating an atmosphere of pure elegance and romance. David's face lit up with joy as he saw his bride approaching. They had met 3 years ago at a medical conference, and their relationship had blossomed quickly. He was a successful cardiologist, she was a dedicated nurse, and everyone said they were the perfect match. Their engagement had been featured in the local newspaper, and their friends often joked about them being the ideal couple. As Emma moved closer to the altar, Father O'Brien watched her carefully. Something about her expression caught his attention. While she wore a beautiful smile for the guests, her eyes told a different story. They held a sadness, a hesitation that seemed out of place for a blushing bride on her wedding day. He had seen this look before, though rarely, and it always troubled him deeply.